Locusts, hundreds of billions of them, are eating their way through East Africa and beyond. Some individual swarms are said to number over 1 billion, and they're predicted to get much, much bigger in the coming months. Today on The Nexus, we're going to be looking at what the farmers can do to save their crops. So much has already been devoured. Plus, the Jekyll and Hyde insect. Why do they change and suddenly feel the urge to swarm? And the prawn of the sky, really? Why don't we just catch and eat them? Some people have been suggesting that would be a good idea. We're going to be discussing all of that and more with our guests from the United Nations, Cambridge University, and on the ground in Kenya. But first, a quick reminder of how we got here.
The recent heavy rainfall has created the perfect breeding conditions.
They thrive after rainy weather because there's so much food to eat, and they grow very, very quickly.
The swarms came from Yemen, then down from the Red Sea to the Horn of Africa.
One locust by itself looks harmless, but it can eat its body mass in plant matter every day.
East Africa is facing its worst locust outbreak in 70 years.
Desert locusts are eating their way across large parts of East Africa,
threatening the food supply for millions of people.
The swarms are spreading fast, up to 150 kilometers a day.
The locusts are devouring crops.
A small swarm can consume the equivalent of food for 35,000 people in one day.
Just to give you a sense of how big these swarms are, one was spotted in a part of Kenya, and in the sky it occupied a space 3 times the size of New York City.
People fight back with whatever means they have. The fear is that the locust numbers could increase 500 times in the next few months.
The window of opportunity is extremely short.
Officials warn the locust outbreak will spread across the entire continent of Africa and into other parts of the world if action isn't taken.
Well, that is alarming, but could it really happen? Let's bring in the people best qualified to actually tell us. Up the top there, we have Danielle Donati, a member of the United Nations Desert Locust Task Force. Malcolm Burrows is an insect neurobiologist from Cambridge University and has dedicated a good bit of his career to studying locusts. And finally, Anastasia Umbati is on the front line in Kenya, working with farmers in the worst affected areas. Danielle, I'd like to come to you first. Your organisation has recently been on a fact-finding mission to Kenya and Somalia. Tell us what your colleagues found there.
My colleagues found the largest infestation in the last 70 years as far as Kenya is concerned, and 25 years as far as Ethiopia and Somalia are concerned. So it's a huge infestation originated in the Arabic Peninsula in an area called, with an interesting name, the Empty Quarter, where 3 consecutive cycles of reproduction, of breeding, have been happening without control. Locusts, they have a capacity to multiply with a 20x factor, in the sense that at every cycle of breeding, the population increased by 20 times. This means that after 3 consecutive cycles with no control, the overall population increased by 8,000 times.
And we hear that it is not yet of plague proportions. As vast as it is, what will have to happen for it to turn into a plague?
If we do not take advantage of this window of opportunity right now, the population of locusts insisting in the Horn of Africa can still increase by 400 times from now to June.
And your colleagues updated the United Nations this week. What exactly did they tell them, and what do they hope that they will do as a response?
But the response is we support the governments of the affected countries with a certain number of actions. First of all, we provide information on the locust swarm movements. We provide technical advice and coordination during the aerial operation of control. We provide technical experts, financial resources from donors, and we help procuring the necessary supplies and equipment.
And what about funding, Danielle?
Funding is proceeding not at the pace we were wishing. As we speak, our Director General is talking to key donors country in New York to explain the necessity of acting rapidly. We intend to control their population, and the main reason for this action is the huge impact that locust might have on the food security of millions of people.
Let's pick up on that point with Anastasia. You're in Kenya, you're on the front line, so to speak, helping farmers. We know that it's going to affect the food supply for people. How bad could it get?
In the short term, it would get very bad, especially for livestock, because the locusts would tend to go and feed on the forage, which ideally is the primary source of animal feeds. So what we are seeing on what we are seeing on the ground is that once the locusts have fed on the green material, is that the livestock would be the first casualties of the locust invasion. Before now we get to them starting consuming the crops in the field. Luckily, say for some of the countries like Ethiopia, some of the farmers had already harvested the crop because they're waiting for the next season that starts at the beginning of next month. So at least there's no much crop damage that has been in the field. But in Kenya, some of the farmers are going to suffer crop losses because we've had very good rainfall for the short rains which were in the October, November, December season. So the locusts may have predated on some of that crop. And I would say the magnitude of the damage or the severity of the effects of the invasion on crop losses that may be seen now in the next season once the farmers have depleted what they have in their granaries.
We've seen pictures of people doing their best to scare off the locust. Can you just describe to us the sort of methods they've tried to use and whether or not they've been effective?
I've actually been a witness to where farmers have tried to scare the locusts in Ethiopia. And what Farm Africa has done together with the local governments is that we're encouraging farmers to use mechanical means of controlling locusts. They could be hooting, that's vehicles are hooting, banging on iron sheets, anything that makes noise, lighting bonfires that would disrupt at least or break a swarm and prevent it from hatching or even invading a certain community. So in Ethiopia, and also what we are telling most of our farmers in other countries is that when the communities come together through such tactics, they can be able to repel the locusts from invading the farms. The unfortunate bit about it is that the locusts then would move to the next village. But again, if the communities come together, then they can be able to save their crops.
Danielle, I wanted to ask you about how you go about counting such vast numbers of flying insects. What technology do you use?
Experience, essentially. We know that a 1 square kilometer swarm can contain between 80 and 120 million individuals. As we speak, in northern Kenya, a swarm of the dimension of 40 by 60 kilometers has been observed. To give you an idea of the impact of a small swarm, a 1 square kilometer swarm, they can eat the same quantity of food that is normally eaten in one single meal by 35,000 people.
Danielle, let's just bring in a map now of where this locust upsurge began. Scientists believe it started in the so-called empty quarter, an area that takes up part of Oman, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. And you can see
Right.
how they spread from there to other parts of Saudi Arabia and Yemen and up into Iran, and then crossing into the Red Sea, into the Horn of Africa, and even further afield. Now, Danielle, some people are linking it to global warming. Other experts say it couldn't have been prevented. It's got nothing to do with that. What's your take on it?
For sure, there is a component linked to the climate change. I cannot tell you the weight of this component, but for sure, the unusual rains are very often a consequence of climate change. So probably yes.
We did hear at the end of that first report that it could spread to the entire continent of Africa. What are your forecasts at the moment?
The risk is to see a further expansion of the infestation to South Sudan, to Uganda, to Sudan itself, and in another area in the Near East region. The real risk is to see this infestation, this upsurge, switching into a plague, a regional plague, if the control operations are not effective or are not implemented in the right time frame.
Now, Danielle, as big as this is, it doesn't yet qualify as a plague. What's the difference between what we're seeing now and a plague?
In a nutshell, a plague requires years to be brought back to recession. We are still working with the objective of normalizing the population of desert locust within 2020. A plague will probably expand its negative impact over the coming 2 years, for sure.
Danielle, thank you for that. Let's just take a closer look at the locust itself now, and they've been described as the Jekyll and Hyde of the insect world. On the left there, you have how they start life, a harmless hopping insect, a nymph, if you like, and then under certain circumstances, they turn, generally speaking, into the solitary locust, but they can also become the gregarious type, the sort of semi-crazed swarming cannibals that were being described just recently. They're so different in appearance that until 1921, scientists thought they were an entirely different species. This is the short-horned desert locust, Chistocerca solitaria, a member of the grasshopper family. As the name would suggest, a pretty harmless and solitary insect, so shy that it actually avoids contact with other locusts, and it tends to stay this way the whole of its short life, around 6 months. But under certain circumstances, this little creature transforms. The metamorphosis begins when a period of heavy rain follows a drought, and locust populations explode with an abundance of food. But then, as food becomes more scarce, the hungry insects are forced into smaller and smaller patches of vegetation and are forced to interact with one another. The sight, smells and touch of being together stimulate the release of serotonin and sets off an amazing transformation. Within hours, the once shy creatures actually desire to band together and are then known as Chistocerca gregaria, or the gregarious desert locust. More sociable, but now cannibalistic when necessary. Over time, they also change colour and size, actually becoming smaller. All adaptations are for the purpose of moving vast distances to find food. Compared to their previous incarnations, the gregarious desert locust lives fast and dies young, only 2 months, but it is 2 months of mayhem. And this is where Malcolm Burrows comes in now. Malcolm, you've been studying locusts for years in the laboratory. Tell us more about why they transform.
Well, that's what we've been trying to understand for the last few years. As you've said earlier, the normal state for locusts is to live a rather solitary life, avoiding all the other locusts that they can, and to hide away in the vegetation. And then when the rains come, as you've said, and the vegetation grows, the population explodes. And they come together and they form this gregarious state the second that they live in.
And it's in that sort of swarm, working together in those enormous quantities, that's the problem, really, why they are such an enormous pest for humans.
Indeed, and our reason for studying how this transformation occurs was to see if it would be possible to intervene earlier in their life cycle before these swarms start to appear.
At what stage are you referring to, Malcolm?
Well, when they're solitary locusts, because what we can show in the laboratory is that we can change these animals rather quickly from the solitary state to the gregarious state. We can do that by either putting them in a crowd where they smell each other, where they touch each other, and where they see each other. And in the lab, we can simulate this change by tickling the legs of the locust. That seems a very bizarre thing to do, but when they're in a big crowd and bumping up against each other, it's the legs that come into contact with the other animals. So that by simulating this process, and if we tickle the legs for a number of hours, a few hours, we can take one of these animals that's living on its own in its solitary state and turn it into an animal that wants to join in with other locusts and form bands and eventually swarms.
And how can you use that knowledge to prevent them becoming swarms?
Well, by trying to understand the mechanism that is going on so quickly in these animals. And if we examine the brain that controls the part of the legs and the wings of the animal, and we measure the amount of chemicals that are present in those parts of the brains, then we find that when an animal is being converted by tickling from a solitary animal into a gregarious animal, there's a sudden spike, a transitory spike in one particular chemical in its brain. And that chemical is serotonin. And what we could do was to use chemicals that block the action of serotonin. And when we block the action of serotonin in this part of the nervous system, then we got no gregarization of these locusts. They wouldn't switch from the solitary to the gregarious animal.
Do you think that scientists will be able to do this en masse and prevent them from transforming?
That's the hope behind what we're trying to do. If we could attack the chemical serotonin, which is widespread in lots of animals, including us, and it has the same sort of effect on us, it's probably too broad a chemical to go after. But if we were to identify the various receptors for serotonin and some of the other pathways involved, then there might indeed be a way of getting these isolated animals and treating them in such a way that they would not be able to form the swarms.
And a quick question on the eggs. I understand that the eggs can lie dormant in the earth for decades and then are stimulated by rainfall coming into life, as it were. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not sure about decades. But
this is what David Attenborough says. I don't know what he knows about it, but he said it.
Question him.
Well, we asked, but he said he was busy. He's got a new series coming up. Anastasia, I'd like to ask you a question. Some bright sparks are saying, look, this seems to me a great opportunity. Just throw up enormous nets, catch them, eat them. This is happening in some parts of Africa and elsewhere, isn't it?
I'm not really sure whether this is the species of grasshopper that communities consume. There are some, and it's not a lot of communities, that consume locusts that can be fried and can be part of their meals. What is, say, viable suggestions is that if they can be captured, they could be fed into animals. They could be ground and mixed into mashes that can feed, say, chicken and can become animal feed. So there's a lot of suggestions, but for communities eating, not many communities consume them. And unfortunately, the locusts have actually avoided the communities that consume them. So they're not where the communities can access.
Oh, that's a bit of bad luck there. So there's no plans to commercially farm locusts then?
No, not really. And I think the communities are very specific on their species of grasshoppers that they go and feed, and it's also at a very specific stage. It could be only at the nymph stage. So the gregarious stage and the solitary stage, then the communities are not likely to be feeding it at that point or at that stage.
Anastasia Mbatia, Malcolm Burrows and Danielle Donati, thank you all very much. We're going to turn on to something a little bit different now. You know, to a scientist, a locust is just a locust, a member of the grasshopper family, an insect, nothing more. But throughout human history, they've often been seen as something to fear.
They're like locusts. They're moving from planet to planet, their whole civilization. After they've consumed every natural resource, they move on.
Well, that's a bit of an unfair comparison. They're not that nasty. Still, fair or unfair, the locust has been a symbol of terror for millennia, certainly going back to the Old Testament, when God commands Pharaoh to let my people go so that they may worship me. And if you refuse to let them go, I will bring locusts into your country tomorrow. Pharaoh resists and is duly punished with 10 plagues, including locusts. And it's been downhill for the locusts ever since. Hollywood hitting the hopper relentlessly.
Where's my food?
In A Bug's Life, you even feel sympathy for ants, but not for the hopper.
Are you saying I'm stupid?
And it's not just Hollywood, Japanese anime too.
Yada, batta kirai.
Even the surrealist artist Salvador Dali was a grasshopperophobe, painting a locust next to a skull and ants, depicting death and decay.
Oh yeah.
And yet, crickets, related to grasshoppers, are given a starring role in Pinocchio.
My. Say, that's pretty swell.
Well, let's bring in our final guest now, and Rockin' Robbie Billups runs his own YouTube channel in Alabama, where he discusses all things pop culture. Robbie, how did the locusts get such a bad rep?
I would definitely think that the bad rap started with prehistory. You know, they were mentioned in ancient Egyptian culture, they were mentioned in Chinese culture, and of course the biblical stuff. They were, of course, one of the plagues of the Exodus. They were mentioned in the book of Revelation as these demonic, like this demonic swarm of infestation. So I really think that a lot of the doom and gloom aspect from pop culture has kind of come from that kind of aspect.
And modern day Hollywood, well, even the golden era, you might say, has been using them ever since.
Oh yeah, ever since. I mean, 10 Commandments, there have been like what? There were the two 10 Commandments, one in 23, one in 56, and then Exodus, Gods and Kings. So they just added this idea of this alien swarm of absolutely catastrophic devastation.
And what about in science fiction?
In science fiction, they're used a lot. Like in 1957, there was a movie called The Beginning of the End, and that's one of the big movies about these giant mutated locusts. And there was a movie in 74 about the same thing. And then in 2005, there was one about bioengineered locusts. And so they kind of really start spinning out of that. And then even in Independence Day, the aliens, the harvesters, as I saw in your clip there, you know, they're mentioned as being the space locusts. They come and they just devastate everything and take it on and just move on forward, right?
It's not always bad, though, is it? Is there a superhero by Marvel?
There is. There's a character called the Red Locust. She was recently introduced in the pages of Champions. There was an X-Men and Hulk villain back in the Silver Age, which is in the 60s, who was locust themed. He could control locusts, but it's nice to see a heroic interpretation of the character, and it's a more recent addition to Marvel mythology.
And is it one of those sort of dark characters, a hero but also an anti-hero?
No, she actually is a very kind of a positive hero. She has a suit of armor that gives her certain abilities, kind of like an Ant-Man type thing. So she doesn't really, have the control over the locust like the original villain character did, but using that name. And it's really interesting because the locusts, when they swarm together, they're viewed as kind of this villainous, devastating thing. But when they're done, you know, like the grasshopper, the cricket, when they're kind of on their own, they're not so bad. They're kind of benevolent. They're actually like sages of wisdom and stuff like that.
When you talk to cartoonists, do they ever tell you what it is about the physical characteristics of a locust that makes them great villains?
Well, they're creepy looking. They're like insects have always been creepy to us, you know, and it's something other, it's something alien. It's definitely not what we usually see. And I also think that the idea that we know, even if it's in a subconscious level, we know that aliens outnumber us. And so maybe that's a part of it as well. But they definitely look creepy. They look alien. They look like something otherworldly.
And what is your favorite locust character?
My favorite locust character is the Lord of the Locusts. It's from a comic book by Jeff Smith called Bone. And the villains in that piece are pretty much all locusts. And the hooded one was their leader. And spoilers, it turns out he's the Lord of the Locusts. Very, very creepy.
Well, Rockin' Robbie Billups, thank you for this light-hearted take on the locust situation. Appreciate it. And thank you for watching at home and on your phones. Remember, you can see this and all our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. But for now, goodbye. See you next week.